Hello again, and welcome to the second and final video in my lecture series on the Gilded Age, more specifically immigration and migration. And today we're going to be looking at the last part of the PowerPoint that will be focusing on the early reformers, as well as some political stuff such as the Populists, and we are also going to take a peek at education during this time period, both in primary, secondary education, as in high school and elementary school, as well as the colleges and collegiate education for minorities. So in the last video, I talked a lot about xenophobic actions and the issues with xenophobic ideas and organizations in the United States as a result of all of these immigrants coming into the country. Well, as a reaction to this, as you could say that these xenophobic people were a reaction to the large influx of immigrants, as a reaction to the xenophobes, we see the foundation of reformers. A large number of people who kind of think about, whereas comparing to the the older Americans said that, oh, it's the fault of these immigrants for the nation's problems. They're saying, actually, we don't think that is the fault of immigrants. We think it's your guys' fault. Because the idea they thought was that, well, these people have just arrived here. How could it be their fault that the country is messed up? Why is it their fault that the country is a problem? They haven't been here long enough to do anything. It's actually your guys' fault. You oldcomers, you people who have been here for many, many years and your family has been here for generations. It's your fault that the country is messed up because you guys have been here longest and you guys have been the ones doing the messing up. So it's your fault because you're the ones who've been here. This country is your responsibility. That was what their reasoning was behind that argument. And instead of saying, oh, we should just send these people away, they said, no, we need to rehabilitate these people. We need to take these immigrants and we need to help them better themselves through our own efforts as well. So, for example, we see the rise of people like Jane Addams, who went in Chicago and she built Hull House. And what Hull House was it was a kind of, you could compare it to the YMCA of today, in that you could kind of go there, and if you needed a place to stay, you could stay there, you could study, you could read, you could relax. It was a way to get away from the slums, and they basically would build this building in a slum in Chicago, and educated young men and women would settle in these houses, and what they would do is they would take the time to educate and assist people who were living in poverty, and they would also use that experience to help they themselves understand the struggles of the poor living in these areas. So they would use the Hull House and other places as schools and as refuges from the outside, the harshness of the outside and the slums, those filthy conditions. They had a place where they could escape. And you could probably argue that the people who ran Hull House were the first social workers. Here, this slide has a photograph of Hull House itself, and you see a little inset that I have put in there of Jane Addams, so you can kind of see that it's quite a large building. It's 3 stories. So you could house a decent number of people in here who were trying to teach or who were living here, perhaps because they had nowhere else to go. You could have classes. You could maybe have sort of place to learn, maybe sewing, teach people a trade of some kind, some sort of a job they can get that might help them to better themselves, might be higher paying. So kind of you can almost say it's like more of a community college, or it's a place for people who don't have anywhere else to go to help improve themselves. So good comparison, like the YMCA, because the YMCA now is more of a gym, but the way it used to be when it was founded was you could go there and they'd charge you $1 a night or something like that, or $1 a week, very, very low rent housing, and you'd have a room. Oftentimes that room would be shared with one other person, and you could go there. They had showers, they had everything that you would need in a house, and you could just stay there if you needed to, and until you got yourself more on your feet. That's kind of what. So if you ever heard of the song by Village People, YMCA, that's what if you listen to the lyrics, what they're talking about, that is actually some of the stuff that was started by people like Jane Addams with Hull House. Similarly to Hull House, we see a kind of private education system springing up of trying to help people with more practical matters and trades and skills like that. We also see the spread of learning in the public sector as well, so public schools. So I believe I've mentioned a few times in class the concept of FAPE, free and public education. Well, this is kind of one of the places where that begins, is we see the spread of free and compulsory education in the sense that public schools begin opening up. And the reason this is significant is because in these schools we see children of all immigrant races begin attending school together. And this is where we really see that American ideal of the melting pot coming into play. Because as we talked about previously, immigrants would usually live in cities that were, or in areas that were like regionally, so they would you'd see all the Polish people living in one area, you'd see all the African American people living in one area, you'd see all the German people living in one area, all the Jewish people living in one area. They would be separate people. They would decide to separate themselves into different communities. Whereas with these public schools, a lot of people who are settling in different communities will then go to a public school that maybe takes people from different communities and puts them in classes together. And so because of this, you have these blending of ideas, and you have people all kind of, despite being from different backgrounds, coming to a place to learn in one specific area. And that's kind of where we see more of that contribution of the homogenous American culture, which I've mentioned a few times before as well, which is that you have all these people coming to this one place where they're all being taught more or less the same thing, and then taking that thing home to their parents. And it's that thing is what kind of makes Americans. So at school, at home, for example, the families would speak their country's native language, but at school, students would speak English. So if you were Polish and you spoke Polish at home, well, when you went to school, you would speak English, but then when you went back home, you would speak Polish again. And so what winds up happening with this is that children begin to sound less like their parents and more, quote-unquote, American. And they would also teach their parents English as well as the American customs that they had learned in school. And if you want a good example of this, I have a friend who he was born in the he was born in England, but then he moved to the United States when he was like 2. So what's interesting is his parents have their British accent, but he doesn't. But what's interesting about that is I've heard him talk to his parents, and when he talks to his parents, he talks to them with a British accent, and he can put one on very easily. So that's kind of an example of that switching, where when he's with me and my friends, he talks like in an American accent, but when he's with his parents at home with his family, he talks in a British accent. So that's a very, I think, clear-cut example of the kind of trend that I'm talking about here in this period. And because of all this growth, we see a lot of schools. So like by 1900, there was about 6,000 high schools in the United States with almost 520,000 students in attendance, which made the U.S. one of the world's first really literate nations, with large numbers of people becoming literate in government-wise and in sort of national terms, you could say. To illustrate some examples of these schools, I found 2 quite interesting images. So this one I thought was quite nice. I saw it when I was trying to do research, and I said I must put this into this presentation immediately. And what it is, we see as kids in a school, elementary school, and they're holding up all of these different signs to show what different ethnicities they are. And so we see Slavic, we see Greek, Polish, Italian, Russian, Czech, Lithuanian, Jewish, Spanish, Croatian, Bulgarian, Hungarian, Austrian, German, a lot of Mexicans, so a lot of different European and even some South American identities and ethnicities being portrayed in this one elementary school class. At least I presume that it is one elementary school class. And you notice they may have all their different flags, they have their different country flags, but what are they standing in front of? A very large red, white, and blue American flag to kind of show that unity in that we are all coming from these different countries and these different backgrounds, but at the end of the day, we are all, in fact, Americans. And another way that we see this happen is with the Pledge of Allegiance that we do every morning, or at least we used to before we went online. I mean, now that we're online, I don't know about you, but I don't stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. If you want to, that's up to you. That's just my thing. But when you see that start in public schools, and you notice. Now, this I thought was quite an interesting photograph because it's something you guys may not know. What you're witnessing is a photograph of what's known as the Bellamy Salute. And this was the original way in which you were supposed to, when you said the Pledge of Allegiance, instead of putting your hand over your heart, you extend your hand outwards and upwards towards the American flag in a fashion that you see in this photograph. And something that you notice that's interesting, if this was a full-on class, I would say, well, what do you guys think? Why do you think we don't do this anymore? And the reason we don't do this anymore is because during kind of the 1930s, Hitler rises to power in Germany, and he adopts the Nazi salute, which is very, very similar looking to this. And we realized we don't think that we want to be doing a thing every morning at the beginning of school that looks very, very similar to what the Nazis are doing in Europe. So kind of during World War II, we kind of abolished the Bellamy salute and move it to putting your hand over your heart, which we still do today. And I think one thing that's interesting is if you look at the child in the center of the picture with that white shirt on, he's kind of staring at the cameraman like he knows that there's some strange things going on. He's like, I'm not sure what's going on here. I don't think I like it. I'm not sure it's right. Or it could just be that he's a kid and he doesn't know what's going on because he wasn't listening when his teacher was telling him what to do. It's possible. I mean, anything's possible. You never know. You never know. So we've talked about regular education in terms of public, so high school, elementary school. Now let's talk about colleges and secondary education. So a lot of colleges wind up being founded to cater to immigrants who want to become more educated and become leaders. So the Morrill Act was passed as part of this, which grants land to the states in the public domain to be used to specifically set up colleges. Many of these schools offer trade education courses, so to learn trades, to become craftsmen, to perhaps become teachers or civic leaders, to educate themselves and better help their communities. A lot of the time, we see these colleges being funded by wealthy benefactors who use, maybe out of guilt for any labor issues they might have had, or for just wanting to look good in the public eye, PR-wise. We see, for example, Leland Stanford funding Stanford University, named after his son. Cornelius Vanderbilt University. John D. Rockefeller University of Chicago. He was with the University of Chicago. Interesting note, Vanderbilt University was their mascot is the Commodores, and that's because Cornelius Vanderbilt's nickname was the Commodore. Additionally, their logo, I believe, has oak leaves and acorns on it. That's because that was the crest of the Vanderbilt family was oak leaves. So a little bit of an interesting side note there. Additionally, we see the foundation of more HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, become founded as wealthy Northerners donate money to assist schools for African Americans in growing so that they can better themselves. And we see this with the foundation of places like Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. You can see a picture of him on the top right. And he would train African Americans to be better farmers and workers as well as community leaders. It was believed that African Americans, at least he believed, that African Americans should train for jobs and trades, not for academics. And his kind of motto there was that self-respect, self-help, and self-education would bring African Americans the opportunities that they desired. Now, on the other end of the spectrum in that case is W.E.B. Du Bois and his Niagara movement, and there's a picture of him in the bottom right of the screen there. He had a PhD from Harvard, and his thing was that he demanded all rights for African Americans now, in the sense of he's saying we should not earn our rights through work. We should just have our rights because we're humans and because that is the right thing to do, which I agree with, frankly. He opposed all laws and customs that treat African Americans differently from other people, and he demanded that all African Americans must get the right to vote unimpeded, because while they technically had the right to vote under Reconstruction and the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, that was often being denied to them by governments in the South, so he wants more aggressive enforcement of those amendments in the South. And now I want to change gears a little bit and talk about politics in the Gilded Age before I end the video. So what happens we see the rise of a new party called the Populists. And the reason we're kind of looking at the Populists is because as I go through what their platform is, their political platform, a lot of the issues they bring up have either already happened today or are still issues today in the world of politics. So populism, that comes from the Latin word populus, which means the people. So it's a party that's about the people, claiming to be representing the people, the way the people feel. Kind of mass representation, you could say. It was largely made up of farmers, former radical Republicans, and reform-minded politicians. They kind of seek to reform. their kind of platform is that we are meeting in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. So they're looking at these kind of issues with the Gilded Age. So they talked about political corruption. We talked about the shady business practices of a lot of these tycoons with labor issues and things like that. And so that they believe that there's just corruption everywhere. Everything, the government everywhere is just corrupt. There's so much corruption, it's not even funny. They said business is prostrated, homes are covered in mortgages, labor is impoverished, and the land is concentrated in the hands of capitalists. And they mean is like everything is concentrated in the hands of a very few amount of people. A large number of people are being left out by this capitalist system that we have. They also declared that major political parties of the day are only interested in power and plunder. So we see here with the Populists there a formation of a third party. And generally, as far as reforms go, they desired to see reforms of the government. They wanted the free coinage of silver. So, and what that would result in, because there was an issue during the time where money was not very plentiful, is they said we need to put more money into the economy by coining silver and mining silver and minting silver-backed money versus gold-backed money. The problem is that gold-backed money is worth more than silver-backed money. Oftentimes what happened was we would see silver-backed money would be traded in for gold-backed money, and that would put the government in debt a little bit more because they'd had to give out more gold of their the supply that they had. They had to divide it up, and it would not end very well for the government in that case. So this coinage of silver would basically result in an increase in the money supply to an amount roughly of $50 per person. So basically, for every person we have in the United States, we need to have $50 more in the economy. We need to add $50 more for every person who is in the United States today. We need to print $50 more to that will solve our problems. Additionally, they wanted to increase an income tax for the wealthy. They wanted to increase those taxes. They also wanted the nationalization of railroad, telegraph, and telephone companies, and they wanted the direct election of senators via the popular vote. Now, a little interesting note, if any of you have heard of Amtrak, Amtrak is a passenger-only railroad that is owned by the federal government. So in a way, you could argue that prediction has in fact come true in that we do have government ownership of railroads, but only for passenger usage. Freight railroads are generally, at least in the United States, are still private. I know in Europe there's a number that are nationalized and are owned by the government, but in the United States we do not have that. In the United States, passenger rail travel is nationalized. So Amtrak, if you've heard of them. The T in Pittsburgh, PATH, Port Authority, they are owned by the government. If you've ever heard of NJ Transit, they are owned by the government of New Jersey. If you've heard of SEPTA, Southeastern PA Transportation Association, they're owned by the government of, I think, Philadelphia, or if not Philadelphia, the actual government in Harrisburg. They are government owned. They're not private company. I believe on the West Coast you have something called Sounder, which is used in Seattle. Those are some examples of how that political platform is still relevant today, or how it has come true, I could say. Additionally, one of the most famous populists was a man named William Jennings Bryan. He is on the left, on the right there in the picture. And he ran for president 3 times, but unfortunately he lost the election every time. His biggest point was he wanted free silver, which was, as I said, that coinage of silver, $50 per person. That was his biggest selling point, his biggest claim. But he also wanted several other populist platforms that I've already spoken about. His biggest thing was the Cross of Gold speech, which won him the Democratic nomination to run against William McKinley. So he went there and he gave this speech talking about how we shouldn't crucify the working people in the United States upon a cross made out of gold, in that we shouldn't stick to the gold standard of currency if it's going to hurt our economy in the long run. We need to have money when we need it, not just because we can't stick to this one object that's not doing us very good at the moment. Now, despite being a fiery speech giver, a lot of Bryan's ideas and a lot of the talking points that he gave off during the election of 1896 were not really very appealing to the North and people living in the North. A lot of the reason for this is because workers were scared by rumors that had been spread by their employers, which said that if more silver was coined, factories would have to be closed due to inflation. So the guy would be like, oh, well, yeah, that Bryan guy, if he wants to coin more money, we might have to close the factory because the inflation will be too high. We won't be able to make enough money because everything's going to cost more, and you guys are going to have to pay more as well to buy things in stores just because it's going to cost more because of the inflation. And that's still an issue today as well, is the issue of inflation being too high. This very much reflected in the election results, as we see in the map about the show. Bryan failed to carry any of the northern industrial states, which had the majority of electoral votes, because that was where most of the population lived in the north, not in the south, where you have a lot of the farmers and people working on plantations, which is the people who he largely appealed to. So if you look at the map here, you can see that the nation was fairly solidly split. You can see McKinley is in the red. He carried all the northern states pretty much along the line of the old Confederacy, with the exception of Kentucky. And then you can see that Bryan carried more of the southern states, which had the mainly farming and rural areas, as well as the newer states in the territories that had just been freshly new. But because they're so new, they don't have a large number of people living in them. There's less population, so they don't really have as much representation in Congress. You can see Washington State even only has 4 electoral votes that could be given out. Nevada 3, Kansas has 10. It's very, very small numbers compared to at least today. For reference, Washington State has 10 electoral votes today, so you can see that's less than half of what it is now in 1896. Alright, so I want to, before I end this video, I want to kind of give some takeaways from the unit as a whole, talking about not just what I've talked about in this video and the last video, but also in the unit when we were in class before I moved this online. So, generally, many immigrants came to the United States in the search of better lives and opportunities than they had in their country of origin. Additionally, many African Americans moved from the South to the North for the same reasons in the event that became known as the Great Migration. So, additionally, they are moving from the South to the North in search of better lives, better jobs, better opportunities, less racism. Similarly, the same reasons that the immigrants came from other countries in Europe or Asia. These people were often received when they arrived with anger and distrust from those who had already been living in the areas that they were moving to. So, as the book calls them, old comers, which I'm not a huge fan of, the old comers disliked and distrusted the newcomers, these immigrants and migrants moving from the South and from other countries. Additionally, we see the melting pot, quote-unquote, of America lead to the foundations of ethnic communities and the blending of cultures, mainly through the nation's public schools. And that being said, that is the end of this video, and indeed this unit. I'd like to thank you for watching. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come here and sit and listen to me speak for a little bit. And that being said, on Monday, we will begin a new unit, and I will have a new series of videos up, and there will be a new video on Monday, and we will go from there. I will keep you guys updated on Moodle as to what happens, but that being said, you have a nice day, have a nice evening, have a nice whatever you are doing right now, and I'll see you around.